2, 1. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We're going to be talking about indoor air quality and challenges. I'm James Muccio, and I'm here with Sonia Lai. We're occupational hygienists at the Occupational Health Clinic for Ontario Workers, and we are your presenters today. So just a brief outline of today's presentation. We're going to be talking about air quality challenges, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning components. We'll talk about some contaminants. We'll talk about prevention and control methods, and then we'll leave you with some indoor air quality resources. So first, who is the Occupational Health Clinic for Ontario Workers? Well, at each clinic, we have a multidisciplinary occupational health team, which consists of client service coordinators, occupational physicians, occupational health nurses, ergonomists, and occupational hygienists such as Sonia and myself. So we have 7 clinics located throughout the province of Ontario. We have clinics in Hamilton, Toronto, Windsor, Sudbury, Sarnia, Thunder Bay, and Ottawa. So what services do we provide? Well, we're an occupational health clinic, so we service individual workers who have been denied workers' compensation claim, where we assist them with the medical part of their claim. We answer questions related to work-related occupational health and safety issues. We do informational presentations such as this one. And we do workplace visits, usually but with the Joint Health and Safety Committee. We're a little bit unique in that way, in that we not strictly, but mostly work with joint health and safety committees, and then we provide them the recommendations that we make. And when we're not busy doing those things, we do intake clinics or health investigations. This is where we see groups or a group of worker from the same workplaces that all have the same health concerns, and we address them as a group. All right, so let's get into the indoor air quality part of the presentation. So we have a definition here of indoor air quality. So it's the quality of air inside buildings represented by concentration of pollutants and thermal conditions that affect the health, comfort of the occupants. Now, it's never really a goal to satisfy everyone in the building because that's really a hard thing to do. But this is an organization, ASHRAE. So it stands for the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers. And you'll get to know them a little bit better throughout this presentation. But they say if you can satisfy 80% of the people or occupants in that building, you are doing an excellent job.
Thank you, James. So what are some of the causes of indoor air quality challenges? Well, way back during the energy crisis, ASHRAE reduced outdoor intake requirements. So we had a tighter building design. We had a more mechanical versus natural ventilation system, meaning windows were sealed, etc. So it was more of a bursting building type of situation. More synthetic building materials and furnishings were being used and are being used. More office equipment with faxes and lasers and printers and whatnot, laser printers. There was poor design or renovation during this time as well, and lots of overcrowding. So how the building was initially set up might not have been the case with more people now being stuffed into the building, if you will. So the occupant load versus how the building was designed weren't talking to one another. Poor maintenance of the building, as well as not dealing with water leaks in a timely manner. Poorly operated or maintained HVAC systems, especially when the system gets into different hands over the years, where newer folks don't understand the system that are handling the system, or they're told to set different parameters of how much fresh air they're supposed to be bringing in versus how much they ought to be according to standards or guidelines, etc. So a lot of those things cause complications. Inadequate housekeeping of the HVAC system and the building areas itself, as well as the use of cleaning chemicals, which we'll talk about a little bit further, but they also affect naturally the indoor air and the quality therein. Next. So want to talk a little bit about some of the building related diagnoses. So one of the first ones you've probably heard a lot about in media and readings and whatnot in health and safety articles, sick building syndrome. This usually affects 20% or more of occupants, and that shows signs of non-specific mucosal irritation or neurological effects, something more flu-like, if you will. Then there's building-related illness or sickness. In contrast to SBS, this is distinguishable in the sense that you have more specific symptoms affecting only a small group of occupants. Example, Legionnaire's disease is a building-related sickness. And finally, multiple chemical sensitivity. This is where we can label it a syndrome of mild to adverse physiological reactions occur in folks who are susceptible to low levels of multiple chemicals in their work environment. Next. So based on the World Health Organization's work and investigation with NIOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, they define the sick building syndrome as follows, or their symptoms as follows. A category called multiple sick building syndrome symptoms required at least 3 of the following 5 symptoms, and they're all non-specific. And you may be able to relate to them as well. Headache, sore or dry throat, stuffy or runny nose, nasal congestion, unusual fatigue, irritated eyes. And what's unique about this is that the symptoms resolve once you leave the building. So over the weekend, for example, you might feel, oh, I'm feeling great. But then when you return to work, for whatever reason, you're not feeling well again once you're back into that work environment. Next. With building-related illness, an identified illness with a known causative agent. So typical sources of biological contaminants are humidification systems, cooling towers, drain pans, filters, sometimes water fountains as well. Symptoms may be specific or sometimes mimic symptoms commonly associated with SBS, such as flu, fever, chills, cough, etc. Next. So some other examples of infection related to building-related illness are Pontiac fever, aspergillosis, and colds and flu. Allergic reactions include asthma, rhinitis, eye challenges or difficulties, and toxic reactions to toxic molds, for example, mycotoxins, endotoxins, carbon monoxide can be a problem, as well as chemical spills and cancer, such as exposure to asbestos from building materials, which have been manipulated. Thank you. Next. With regards to multiple chemical sensitivity, some people can be sensitive to particular agents at levels which do not have an observable effect in the general population, such as fragrances. And certain chemicals can be sensitizers. So there's a difference between someone being sensitive to something and someone being sensitized to something. So what we're speaking about is sensitization. That's where an individual has a severe immunological response to even a minute amount of a certain chemical to which they're sensitized, and their reaction can be significant in that they might need medical assistance, etc. So we really need to be careful and aware of persons that are sensitized to certain chemicals, etc. Next.
All right, thank you, Sonia. So on the other side of things, we have ergonomics, which everyone is familiar with these days. And ergonomic factors in an office include lighting, noise, workstation design. So there's a lot of factors that go into play there. And then we have workplace or non-occupational stressors. There's a lot of stressors these days for people, both workplace and personal. And then in addition, we have some personal health factors that can play a role in symptomology when it comes to indoor air quality. So as I mentioned earlier, ASHRAE, so again, this is the American Society for Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers. And they have a standard and they talk about ventilation for acceptable indoor air quality. So they say acceptable indoor air quality is air in which there are no known concentrations of contaminants at harmful concentrations. Um, so basically, this is where they come about saying that if you satisfy 80% or more of the people in the building, then that's as good as you're going to get. Um, you can never really aim to satisfy 100% of the occupants. So ASHRAE also has another standard, and this deals with thermal conditions, so temperature. And again, with the thermal, they also say 80% of the occupants, if you aim to please that many, you're doing a good job.
Thanks, James. So this is a graphic just to show you visually how we are bombarded by different factors in our indoor air. So we're going to go through each one of these categories in the next few slides to explain this further. There's so many things that could be affecting us, as we've already spoken about, that can affect how we feel in the workspace that we attend day in, day out. So we're going to talk about thermal comfort a little bit later in the presentation. So we're going to skip over that. I'm going to start with ventilation. Next. So ventilation and the system itself. We have to think about the type of system and its design. It should be suitable for the type of building it is serving. Thermal comfort therein, which we will talk about, but thermal comfort covers temperature, humidity, and air movement. If the air isn't moving according to the guidelines or standards that it's required to move for the given space and for the given number of people in that space, then you're going to have indoor air quality issues. The outdoor air supply falls under the ventilation system naturally, and how much is being supplied into the building and into the workspace. There are calculations for that and there are parameters for that. And if we don't fit or fall under those parameters, you're going to have complaints and you're going to have issues. And most importantly of all is the operation and maintenance of the system. If we don't maintain it, it's not going to work optimally and it's not going to serve us as it was designed to in the first place. So we have to be very diligent with the maintenance of the HVAC systems, etc. Next. So other factors to consider, along with the ones discussed, is the floor space itself. Was it meant to be an open space, workspace, or was it meant to allow for cubicles? Because when you install cubicles and obstructions in different areas, you're also affecting the way the air is distributed to those areas. So you have to make sure that those two systems talk to one another. If you're going to make changes like that, then you have to make sure that the way that the air supply is supplied to that area, it can handle any sort of those obstructions, such as the cubicle parameters or the bordering panels, etc. Renovations. This is a big problem. When folks renovate certain office spaces, sometimes it's not considered, again, how that room was initially meant to be ventilated, if you will. And so if you put up walls or block diffusers, which are areas from which fresh air comes into office spaces, and we've seen this a lot during our time here at OCal, where things are not considered. Renovators come in, make everything look great, except they're not taking into consideration how the office was meant to be ventilated, and did this new workspace consider that? So that's a big problem. Again, the HVAC system itself, it needs to be changed according to the way the building functions have changed, the way the number of occupants have changed, and etc., and how the layout has changed. That often does not change over time. Occupancy loads, etc. This is talking about the number of people allowed in a certain space. So if you If you increase that number, you're going to have issues. Just think of an elevator. When you go into an elevator, it says how many people are allowed at any given time. If you disobey that, you will have issues with the functioning of that elevator, if you will take that analogy, for example. So the same applies with ventilation and number of occupants in a space. Underground parking is great. However, if your ventilation is not robust enough, or it's weak in that it's sucking in air from the underground parking and distributing it to different areas in your space, you will have issues with carbon monoxide and particulates, etc. And folks will become ill if things are not resolved. So those are the other things you need to consider with the ventilation system. Next. So what about contaminants originating from the inside? Office equipment, printers themselves emit particulates, for example. So you have to be wary of that, and you have to put in the right engineering controls wherever you have these types of printers and follow the manufacturer's recommendations. Again, we spoke about renovations, new furnishings. If you're going to have carpets, for example, or the type of desk type equipment, etc., you have to make sure that they are off-gassed um, prior to re-entry or prior to occupants coming into work in that area, so that they are not affected by the new odors that are off-gas from the carpeting and the equipment, etc. You might have a rule for personal fragrances, or you may not, but if you have somebody that's sensitized, then they're going to have some issues with regards to fragrances and whatnot in the workplace. Mold and mildew can originate from the inside of your workspaces if you don't deal with moisture intrusion or spills or water leaks. Even um, the huge water bottles where we have, fresh water for folks, if that falls over, tips over, and you have a spill, you have things to do, especially if you have a carpet. Or if it goes into the wall cavity or the baseboards, etc. If you don't deal with these things within 48 hours, and the habitat is right and the temperature humidity is right, you could start having issues with regards to mold and mildew. So you can create contaminants from the inside as well. Next. Next. Ergonomics. So James talked about this already, but as stated, sometimes it may not be in the air that's causing an indoor air quality issue, but it might be something such as noise or the lighting or the way your computer is set up, and you're getting a glare from the overhead lights or a window, and that could be causing you headaches and fatigue. So sometimes indoor air quality is the last resort for folks to complain that, oh, there's something wrong with the air in my environment, I'm feeling sick, my head is hurting, etc. But sometimes it's the ergonomics or the issues that fall under ergonomics, your office setup, etc., that could be causing your issues as well. Next. And then, of course, there's the elephant in the room. It might just be something else, psychosocial issues in your workplace that are causing you to feel ill at work. You might not feel supported in the workplace. You might be working in a toxic environment. Your workload itself might not be suitable for the type of job that you were meant to do, and it might be you feel overloaded. There could be violence in the workplace. There could be any of those things, but those psychosocial hazards need to be dealt with. And again, those types of issues also fall under indoor air quality because people need something to sort of pinpoint, not knowing that it could be a psychosocial hazard and not an indoor air quality specific hazard, like something in the air itself. Next. So how do you go about investigating all of this? Because it can be tricky. How do you know it's a psychosocial hazard versus an actual indoor air quality issue? Well, how we approach it is we talk to the Joint Health and Safety Committee, because they are our first, that's who we deal with when OCO is allowed onto the premises of a workplace, unless the workplace is completely open, where management has invited us themselves. So we collect the concerns, we have discussions with folks, we review documentation related to the building itself. My favorite is being able to get our hands on the ventilation schematics, because we can solve a lot of problems just by looking at those schematics, by looking at how different workspaces where the air is being delivered from and into the workspaces and how it's being exhausted out of those workspaces. If those are up to date and current to the current workplace, we can solve a lot of issues or find some, if anything, with those schematics. And if not, then we do an informal inspection of the workplace and have a look at the HVAC system, not thoroughly, but we have a look at it and we talk to the maintenance professionals on board and ask questions so that we can get a better idea of, maintenance schedules, et cetera, and how much fresh air they're delivering into the various spaces, et cetera. So we do that, and we do talk to the Joint Health and Safety Committee to ask them what other problems they've had over the course of the last few weeks or months to have now had incurred this type of issue for which we're attending their workplace. Next. So some other things that we can do is take spot check measurements of the carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, the temperature and relative humidity, just to get an idea of the thermal comfort parameters in the workspace. And last resort, if need be, we could do an IAQ survey, a symptom survey, which if the workplace is open to, we would send it out to all folks, and they fill it out anonymously as they wish. And then we sort of crunch the numbers and spew out some statistics on what we found and where the problems for majority of the folks are, and then help the employer try to figure out ways to correct the issues. Next.
All right, thank you, Sonia. Excellent points. All right, now we're going to talk about the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning components, or again, HVAC for short. So what does the HVAC system do? Well, it provides heating and cooling for thermal comfort of the occupants of the building, and it brings in outdoor air and circulates the air within the building. The units filtrate the air. It also exchanges the air to remove moisture, odor, smoke, heat, and airborne bacteria. So again, as Sonia mentioned in the beginning, this is called mechanical ventilation. If you think of old buildings being drafty and letting in air through cracks in the windows, doors, so that allowed fresh air in. But once buildings became airtight, they rely on HVAC systems to bring in outdoor air from the outside. So some of the things we can talk about with an HVAC system are dirty coils or malfunctioning coils. Um, if that occurs, that wastes energy and causes thermal discomfort. And we can talk about cooling coils, how they dehumidify the air. And what happens is condensation builds up, and water can accumulate under these cooling coils. And what happens, you get this pooling of water if it's not draining properly, and the water turns a nice shade of green, and you get a nice microbial habitat for bacteria to grow in there. And that bacteria can then be sucked up into the HVAC unit and spread in the building. I think we do have some pictures of this later on, but when you are doing inspections, you do want to go on the roof and, just look at things and see what's going on. Even you may not even know what to look for, but if you do see pooling water, that's never a good sign. So here is a diagram of air moving through a building. So you have the air coming in from the outside, moving through the air handling unit, which heats or cools the air, and then it supplies air to the various rooms. And then you can see how it's exhausting some air from those rooms. And the guy on the far right here doing some sort of experiment, he has his own exhaust to the outside. So none of what is being exhausted from what he's doing is recirculated. But you can also see how some of the air that's being exhausted from the workers that are just doing office work, some of that air is recirculated. And that's for efficiency reasons. You don't necessarily want 100% outdoor air, especially in the winter or the summer. So therefore, some of the air is recirculated.
James, can I add something to this
Yeah,
slide?
sure.
If you could just point to the outdoor air intake,
Right
which
over
is
here.
right, all the way to the left, and notice where the exhaust is, which is on the rooftop and going perpendicular. That's very important to note, generally speaking, in office buildings, in buildings in general, workspaces, the outdoor air intake and where the exhaust systems are for the various processes in the workspace should be exactly like this, orientated in such a way that they are away from each other. They shouldn't be together naturally because the outdoor air and the exhaust and the outdoor air coming in will just pull in the exhaust. So I just wanted to make mention of this, that this is very important to note that the outdoor air and the exhaust systems should be several feet from one another, if not more than that, and at different locations of the building,
Yeah,
basically.
definitely, because you don't want this exhausted air coming back in.
Correct.
Okay, so here we have another example. This one is for construction isolation. So it's pretty much the same picture, except what's going on here is this guy is painting this area here to the right. And likely he would be doing a little bit of sanding, so maybe fixing of some drywall. So any contaminants he's generating are being exhausted out. So they're no longer part of the recirculated air. Okay, so I think Sonia mentioned this earlier, but just this shows a diagram of what should be done when there's any type of construction going on. That way, these workers are not exposed to any of the contaminants that are generated. So this is just a diagram of the HVAC unit itself. Um, so if we start over here, this is the outdoor air here. There's some louvers here that can mix the recirculated indoor air and outdoor air, and then that air gets filtered and then it gets cooled. And here's our fan here, and the air is being supplied. So this just gives you an idea of what the system does and what it looks like. All right, now we can talk a little bit about HVAC maintenance. The easiest thing that can be done is maintain the filters. They do have a recommended service life. Um, Most people are set up on a seasonal change type of schedule as far as timing. Sometimes some workplaces may choose to combine filters with a carbon or charcoal layer. This can remove, any vapors that may be in the air or odors that, can possibly be captured with that charcoal layer. And it's always good to ensure, you have the right size filters and that they're tight fitting. So what I mean by the right size filters is not filters that are the wrong size and they're jammed in, similar to this picture. So what's going to happen here is the air is not going to be filtered. The air is going to take the path of least resistance and come through this opening here and all along the top here. So this is not ideal. So here's another picture of some air filters. Again, you can see this one has a big opening here. And again, the air is going to take the path of least resistance right through that opening and not be filtered. So some people may be familiar with these diffusers and grills. So I'm going to start with this one over here on the right. This is, I think, the most common one I've seen. So this is a square ceiling mounted diffuser, and diffuser, I mean diffuses the air in different directions. This is where the air is supplied into the room, and it comes out each and every side here in all different directions. But we've also seen these, what's in the middle here, linear ceiling mounted diffusers. I guess it sort of hides where the air is coming from, so it doesn't look like something big like this other one here. But these are areas where you would feel the air coming into the occupied space. And over here on the left is the return air grill. So you'd have air coming out these diffusers, and the air is then returned through this grill here. And then the air would move, if you think of that diagram, back to the exhaust ducts somewhere. Some of it's recirculated, some of it's exhausted. All right, so now we're going to talk about some contaminants that can be found. So there are activities in the building that can produce contaminants. For example, occupants in the building, human occupants, expire carbon dioxide. So if you don't have enough fresh air coming in, the carbon dioxide can build up throughout the day. Again, I mentioned construction, renovation, and any maintenance or construction in the building produce contaminants. One thing is the HVAC unit. If you overload the filters or when you pass the recommended service life, they're not going to be as efficient at capturing contaminants. And there's also biological contamination from the cooling system. If you remember back, I talked about that pooling water under the cooling towers or any pooling water on the roof. Contaminants can be sucked in. If there's sitting water, there's bacteria growing in it that can be sucked in. Some outdoor sources of contaminants. So as we saw in that diagram, the HVAC unit is bringing air from the outside. So whatever is out there can be sucked into the building. So you can take a look at that roof intake. And if there's exhausts from kitchen, laboratory fume hoods, plumbing vents, anything that's exhausting, if that roof intake is near those, it can recirculate what's being exhausted and bring it right back in. If intakes are located, sometimes a little bit lower on the building, then it will capture vehicle emissions and bring in possibly carbon monoxide from, idling trucks that could be out there. Outdoors, also, there's always pollen, dust, fungal spores outside that can be brought into the building from the intake that's outside. So again, we're going to mention ASHRAE here, which is again the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers. So what they like to use is carbon dioxide as an evaluation of the air turnover rates in the building. And they do have some documentation that says approximately 17 cubic feet per minute per person should be coming into the building. And this is equivalent to about 900 parts per million of carbon dioxide, if the outdoor carbon dioxide is about 400. So, a lot of times we'll be asked how much air should be coming in, and well, it all comes down to how many people are in the occupied space. And as far as carbon dioxide goes, there are some recommended levels. The Ministry of Labor, they do recognize outdoor can range depending where you are from 400 to 500 parts per million. Inside the building, they say 600 is not a problem. If you're getting up to 800, you might have a possible problem of not bringing enough outdoor air. And at 1,000, they definitely say more outdoor air is needed. However, with that being said, the occupational exposure limit in Ontario is 5,000 parts per million, but that is for industrial workplaces. So they do recommend the 1,000 for office environments. So when I talked about that, cubic feet per minute per person, this is one way of measuring how much air is coming in. Now this contraption this guy's holding up fits over what I called the diffuser earlier. And if you remember that big square one, this fits over that and it will measure how much air is coming through that diffuser in CFM, cubic feet per minute. And on the side here on the right, this is another instrument to measure airflow. But if you are measuring it from a diffuser where the air is coming out everywhere, this instrument on the right won't really do it for you. You need one that covers the whole thing and gives you a more accurate reading.
So we promised we were going to talk about thermal comfort. With regards to thermal comfort, ASHRAE, and James has already alluded to who ASHRAE is, they state that indoor environments for the summer should range between 23 to 26 degrees Celsius, and in the winter months, 20 to 23.5 degrees Celsius is reasonable, with fluctuations of 2.2 degrees per hour. The Ministry of Labor only talks in the industrial sense about a minimum temperature in the workplace of 18 degrees C. So that's in industrial workplaces. So we need to be cautious of how we interpret the Occupational Health and Safety Act. That is for industrial workspaces. So if you want to have a guideline of some sort, you go by these ASHRAE ranges, and 80% of your people will be satisfied with the thermal comfort in the indoor environment with regards to temperature. Next, I did want to mention, we're saying Ministry of Labor in these slides, but we recognize that their name has changed to the Ministry of Labor, Training and Skills Development. So apology for that. Next. So with regards to relative humidity, what's important to note is if your relative humidity is too high, such as, let's say, as written here, greater than 65%, you will enable biological growth. So mold, mildew, that type of thing. So you want to make sure you're below that level. And if you're too low, below 30 or below 20%, you're going to have folks who wear contact lenses, for example, have dry eyes and have very irritation, if you will. Dry mucous membranes, there'll be a lot more static electricity, etc. So you want to make sure you're in a happy range. So the happy range is between, I would say, generally speaking, 30 to 60%. And if you want to be foolproof, having it 50% winter or summer, you'll be in good hands if you can maintain that. But those are the recommended ranges as listed here on the slide, between, I would say, 30 to 60% for both winter, summer. James, you agree?
I definitely agree. I know there's some, changes that with recommendations in the lower limit, but yeah, definitely this, 25, 30, and then 60, definitely.
Thanks. Next. All right, with regards to carbon monoxide, which we also spoke about, this is usually an indicator, as listed here, of vehicle exhaust entrainment. It could be coming from your underground parking lot, or it could be coming around the bordering parking lot on the exterior, and there might be an outdoor air intake, which is also infiltrating vehicular exhaust from the outside, or traffic on the nearby streets of your building. So you have to be very careful and recognize where is it that our outdoor air intakes are coming in and where are we exhausting the air. That's why it's very important to know those things with regards to your building. So with regards to what we have as the occupational exposure limit in the Ontario regulations, the value given is 25 parts per million. That's an industrial value, but that is the value given for carbon monoxide. Health Canada, on the other hand, says it should be no greater than 5 parts per million. Is that correct, James?
Yeah.
Right. So that would probably be more specific to indoor air quality in buildings, in office spaces, etc. So again, you have to be very cautious of how you interpret the Ministry of Labor's regs and the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and how they're spewing out this information, etc. So if in doubt, just call the Occupational Health Clinics for Ontario workers and we'll help you out. But for office spaces, you want to make sure that you're less than 5 parts per million.
Yeah, because an office space, that would be a space that normally you wouldn't find any carbon monoxide.
Correct.
And doing inspections and looking around at the building. I remember going to one place and they did have like it was extremely low levels of carbon monoxide, but we did end up seeing some generators they had on one side of the building, and they did have a lot of power outages, and the generators would kick on and off pretty often, and that was being the exhaust from that was going into the building.
Interesting. Okay. Next. Oh, yes. Odors. We get so many questions with regards to odors, and all different kinds of adjectives are used to describe these odors. And it can be quite challenging to figure out what it is that the our clients are referring to and where the source of the odors are coming from. Sometimes they're generic in the sense that if somebody says there's a musty odor, then we can sort of allude to the fact that it could be something to do with moisture intrusion. So we're looking for areas where there could have been leaks, or we ask questions like, was there a recent flood, etc. And we look at those areas to see if they didn't renovate, or there was no corrective action to alleviate the damaged areas of the building that were flooded, etc., then you're gonna it's more likely than not that you're having a mold related issue, and that's what's causing the odor. Sometimes if there's sewer drainage in certain areas of the building, in furnace rooms or whatnot, and they've been dried up, or there's some issue going on, sometimes odors come from those areas. And if there is an intake, a ventilation intake, or there's an exhaust and it's exhausting into an office space, those odors from the furnace room could be going into the other areas, and that's a whole different issue, but can be alleviated very quickly. But when you have an odor of such sort at one quarter of the building and has nothing to do with the sewer drain, but that's the kind of smell that you're experiencing, that's when those ventilation schematics I mentioned earlier could come in so handy if they're current. And you can then just pinpoint the fact that, oh, we're bringing in air from the furnace room and we're delivering it to this classroom, for example, and it has nothing to do with sewers or anything like that. And that's how you sort of solve that problem without even moving around too much, just by looking at that documentation. That's the golden egg, if you will. We don't always get that documentation. It's not always current, but it's very helpful if it is current. So odors can be tricky, but we try our best to help resolve the issues with regards to odors. Do you have anything to add to that one, James?
No, good points though. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, next. Ozone. So sources of ozone in the workplace include photocopiers, laser printers, fax machines, and sometimes outdoor air itself. And it's very important. We didn't talk too much about health effects of the other contaminants, but with regards to ozone, it can age the lung tissue, it can aggravate breathing problems in certain individuals, and can cause asthma, or um, can cause asthmatics to react more frequently because of its presence. And it can cause allergic responses in certain individuals. Wherever, and I mentioned this earlier, wherever you have a printer, or even the large scale printers, you must make sure that you are exhausting that room, if it's in a room, or that area where it is serving folks for printing, etc. That area needs to be exhausted, and fresh air supplied specifically for the printer itself. Um, and that often we see missing with regards to workplaces that we visited. Uh, as per the slide, they say equipment often has a charcoal filter to absorb the ozone, but it's not changed frequently. So there we go back to maintenance and lack thereof. Um, Local exhaust directly to the machine may be necessary for high volume usage, particularly if it's in a small room. So those are the controls that are required for this type of office equipment. Next. Noise. Noise, usually we think noise is an industrial problem. Okay, 85 decibels and above, we have issues, we need to put in hearing protection, and we don't need that in office environments. Well, that's not the case. You won't see hearing protection in office environments. However, noise can contribute to symptoms of fatigue in workers, headaches, strains, etc. And it can impact your ability to do work if noise is affecting you. Sometimes noise is obvious, like if you're working in a call center environment, for example, or if you're working in an open space environment, or even cubicles, depending on how the situation is in the workspace and it hasn't been correctly thought out, you could have noise bouncing off different walls in the ceiling and could be delivered to your space from a worker's several feet away from you. So you have to be very cognizant of how the workspace has been laid out with regards to noise. And there are certain things that you can correct. White noise, for example, and we see this in libraries to help alleviate shuffling of paper and other types of noises that occur in libraries, for example. So that's one thing that we can introduce. But yes, noise can be a contributing factor to the indoor health, if you will, of occupants in an office space. Next. So we have spoken about biological contaminants. This is a review slide. This is about exposures to molds. And again, mold is not the problem. The problem when we speak of mold is moisture. So if you've had a flood, if you've had a spill, a water spill or a chemical spill of some sort, which is aqueous in nature, waterborne in nature, you have to address that within 24 to 48 hours. If you don't, then you've created an issue where you're going to have mold or mildew start its process of inhabiting that space and proliferating. So you want to make sure that you handle those situations carefully. Next. The other thing actually to mention about mold is one, oftentimes people, if you see it, they often call us up and say, can you sample for mold? We've seen it, and they send us pictures. And again, I've said it so many times in this presentation, mold is not, you don't need to sample for it. It's there, it's telling you it's there. It's telling you there was a water leak or there is a water leak and it needs to be fixed. And that's what it's crying out. It's crying out for help, if you will. Fix me. I'm showing you my face, but you need to fix me. So always go back one more step when you see mold. Don't sample for mold specifically. Try to figure out why it's there in the first place. Next. So we do have a resource available to you on our website if you go under resources, and it talks about mold. And at the end of the resource, you have this chart. It's not very clear on this particular slide. However, it tells you according to what it is that you're looking at, whether you're looking at paper, you're looking at concrete or carpets, and that it asks you questions with regards to, well, how many square feet are we talking about? Where do you see this mold and what's the square footage? And it lets you know what the corrective action you can take for this particular area if you feel competent enough to handle the situation. If it's a small square footage, then there are parameters that the workplace themselves can take. But if the square footage of the area is greater than indicated here, then it's best to call a competent individual or company that will help remediate the situation and help you with the moisture intrusion and the mold that's present. Sometimes when remediation is required, not sometimes, to correct myself, remediation is almost similar to what we see for asbestos remediation. So mold is taken very seriously, and you shouldn't, if the square footage is large enough, you shouldn't play around with it. You should be handling it with by calling a competent individual or company that can handle this for you. Next. So a little bit of review and talking about prevention and corrective action with some of these issues we talked about today, the challenges with indoor air quality. Next. So
Right,
again,
so let's
oh,
talk a
sorry,
little bit
James.
about prevention and corrective action. So again, we're just going to highlight appropriate design operation of HVAC. You know, it's hard to really say, we can make statements, but unless we're seeing HVAC schematics or at a workplace, looking at things, how do we really know it was designed properly? So a lot of times we are looking at, was there renovations, was there changes, was there walls put up without taking into account the HVAC system. And again, as highlighted earlier, regular HVAC preventative maintenance, changing of filters, cleaning, um, and the last point here, adjusting outdoor air supply to meet recommended levels of carbon dioxide. Um, Kind of a touchy subject when, owners of buildings and properties, they like a tight building. They like the building to be efficient. Um, you open the outdoor air supply and it costs them more money to heat and cool the building. Um, so it's not always as easy as, yep, open those louvers, let more outdoor air in. Well, a lot of times those louvers are controlled from some remote location, that open and close automatically, and I've seen cases where, some computer somewhere is saying they're open, but the little motor that opens them stopped working and they're not open. So there really is a lot of things you to look at and inspect. And um, again, the recommended levels of carbon dioxide. There was that one slide where the Ministry of Labor, they say, if you're at 1,000, you got a problem and should do something about it. Again, outdoor air intakes. We kind of talked already about the location of where, they shouldn't be near exhausts. Idling, they shouldn't be near idling zones. But a lot of times buildings change the purpose of what they are. So maybe something, wasn't an idling zone. Now it is. So it has to be dealt with. Or maybe the neighbors are all of a sudden uh, need an idling zone for pickups, and a lot of places aren't allowing people in, so you got to wait outside to pick up whoever because of COVID and this and that, and there's always the world is ever changing as our functions of buildings and purposes, so we you have to take everything into consideration. All right, so when it comes to water, moisture in the building, it's important to address water leaks as soon as possible. Dry building materials within 48 hours. We say that because after 48 hours, and especially after 72, that's when the mold, if there is any, will really start to grow and be really hard to get rid of after that point. Basically, if it's wet for longer than that, it should be thrown out. Um, Isolate renovation emissions. We had that, if you picture that one slide that we had where the air was moving, again, we always like to highlight that fact that if you're producing contaminants, whether it be dust or vapors from painting, that should be exhausted out separately. Um, Something that's kind of a general recommendation when we talk about housekeeping when it comes to cleaning, uh, vacuum cleaner that has a HEPA filter will help reduce dust. A lot of workplaces are putting portable HEPA filters in to help remove viruses from the air. Um, Another point, remove excess water immediately. Don't want water sitting anywhere. Um, Thoroughly dry wet materials. Again, if they're let wet longer than 48 hours, they got to go. And then water damaged ceiling tiles should be, yeah, they should be replaced. But when you go to replace it, you need to look up in the ceiling and see if anything's leaking. That way you're dealing with the source, because if you just replace it and there's a drip there, it's just going to get wet again. So you do need to go to the source. So I just have a picture of here. This is an HVAC unit on a roof surrounded by water. So flat roofs are never ideal because you always get standing water, which attracts birds and other animals. So it's a good idea to inspect roofs. Although flat roofs are not ideal, Generally, there is drainage, and it is easy for those drains to get blocked by stone or debris. So eliminate individual sources of pollution, and this kind of has to do with new furniture or building material. So new furniture has that smell or an odor to it. Usually that's from the glues in it drying. And a common off-gassing agent is formaldehyde. So usually that's what you're smelling. So that material should be given time to off-gas. Um, or it's going to take the HVAC unit a long time to get that off-gassing odor out of the building. It's kind of something hard to do because someone orders new furniture and then it comes in, and then what do you do? So it is definitely something hard to deal with.
So preventing indoor air quality problems, again, some review here. You have to make sure, as we already stated, that the ventilation and the system itself meets the occupancy needs. You can't overcrowd without thinking about if the ventilation system can handle it. Eliminate standing water from rooftops and crawl spaces, as James has alluded to. Control growth of biological contaminants and whatnot in the HVAC system itself, in the drip tray. Exhaust emissions from office equipment need to be, you need to put in the engineering controls there so that you don't have any issues with ozone or particulates. Store all chemicals in cool, when well ventilated areas, depending on the functionings of your space in the building. Yes, this is very important. And record keeping for the HVAC system maintenance is very, very important. It keeps people on track, but it's also important for due diligence for the employer, the building owner, and the maintenance professionals on board, custodian staff. It's very important to have that and have that available to people like the Joint Health and Safety Committee so that they can peruse that information and know that, you know, things are being managed, and or if they're not, then they can help others to realize that, you know, this stuff needs to be logged so that we can keep on track of changing filters, for example, and cleaning, etc. Next. So some other items for review, as already stated, address water leaks promptly, especially the given range is between 24 to 48 hours. Assess cleaning chemical usage and substitute for least toxic and odorous. Review the safety data sheets before purchase to ensure that people with multiple chemical sensitivity, for example, won't be affected by the purchases you're making for the cleaning of the various areas. Isolate renovation emissions from occupied work areas, as James has demonstrated. That often does not happen. It's not factored in during the renovation plan itself, but it should be. So if there's any Joint Health and Safety Committee members listening in or employers listening in, this is something that you should be taking into consideration before you renovate. Make sure that, yep, if you want to do a great renovation, that's perfect, but make sure you take the HVAC system into account as well as neighboring areas. You don't want to contaminate them and disrupt them during your renovations. And if it's possible, encourage a fragrance-free workplace so that those people with multiple chemical sensitivity, for example, who know they have this ailment, are not affected, and those who don't know, they're not affected as well. Fragrances can be an issue in workspaces. Next. Facilitate good communication between occupants and building HVAC maintenance. So I often encourage, if you have a robust health and safety committee, to have, or not, to have maintenance staff be part of that committee so that a lot of the issues that might be coming up on your inspections or complaints that you might be receiving can be addressed with the custodian or maintenance staff that might be on board on your committee, and you can address those issues. Having them involved with you will encourage a more open communication relationship with them, and that they'll understand where you're coming from and you can understand where they're coming from in the whole aspect with regards to HVAC, etc. And it doesn't have to be such a mystery. Educate occupants regarding the HVAC system and their impact on conditions. Treat concerns with respect and dignity, and take a problem-solving approach in dealing with the concerns with a prompt response, as prompt as you can, so that folks know that you're handling the situation and that their situation is being validated by you taking some sort of action, by asking questions even, etc. Next. So we do have some resources available for you, as this was a sort of synopsis of challenges that you face, that you can face with regards to indoor air quality. And these resources go into deeper depth on the topics. So we can just go through them. Next slide. This is a very old resource, but things don't change. So the content therein is very helpful. This is from Health Canada, and it's Indoor Air Quality in Office Buildings, a Technical Guide. It's a really helpful resource. I won't go through all of them, but these are the types of resources that we've listed for you, and they're available to you on the net. So please do peruse them if you're having any issues. And if not, you can always call the clinics to assist you with your indoor air quality issues. James, wrap up.
So we have another resource here. It's a Health Canada guide, again, fungal contamination in public buildings. Very relevant document. Here's another really excellent resource on mold remediation in schools and commercial buildings. A lot of times there is companies that you would hire to do the remediation, but this gives you a good starting point and gives you knowledge about everything that's needed. And this is the IRSST. This is a group out of Quebec, and this is called the Guide for Prevention of Microbial Growth in Ventilation Systems. And this is a document that is basically one that I always recommend people use. So it's the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene guidelines for remediation of fungi in indoor environments. And it even goes into detail about, if you have this much square footage of mold growth or fungi, then do this. And, it's grouped on different sizes. So it guides you as the process of what you need to do for remediation. It's excellent. And this might be the last one here, but this is IQ. It's from the US, EPA. It's tools for schools. And it gives the schools actually tools to use to evaluate the air quality. If you remember back to grade school, it's been a long time for me. But, nowadays, if you look at some of the schools that have been renovated, they have brand new windows where I remember being in an old school and it was drafty. But now I know those drafts were good. They were bringing in fresh air. Um, so that's a really good one. This tools for schools. Here's one, tools for Canadian schools. Excellent resource as well. And I think that's all Sonia and I have for you. So thank you for listening.
Thank you.